Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it, thanks. The morning was heavy with mist as Eric Tate stood outside the ranger station, the weight of exhaustion pressing against his bones. Yesterday's chaos still lingered in his mind, the skewers breaching the boundary, the hikers' terrified faces, the explosion that had collapsed the valley. The boundary was sealed, temporarily, but the cryptids would be back. They always were. His radio crackled. "Tate, report to command, new assignment." Eric suppressed a groan, grabbed his rifle, and made his way toward the station's communications room. Inside, a secure monitor flickered to life, revealing the grim face of his handler. The man's dark suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable. "Eric," the handler began, "we've detected unusual seismic activity in the center of Area 12. It's spreading outward. We need you to investigate." Eric frowned, leaning closer to the screen. "Seismic? You mean an earthquake?" "Not exactly. The patterns are irregular," the handler replied, his tone deliberately vague. "Proceed to these coordinates." A new location blinked on Eric's GPS, far deeper into the restricted zone than he'd ever gone before. Eric narrowed his eyes. "What aren't you telling me?" "Nothing relevant," the handler said curtly. "Just do your job, Ranger Tate." The screen went black. Eric cursed under his breath, shouldered his gear, and headed out. The coordinates on his GPS led him miles into the heart of Area 12, territory untouched for years, where even the agency's surveillance equipment rarely functioned. That didn't sit right with him, but his orders were clear. The forest grew darker as Eric pushed deeper, the towering sequoias growing denser and twisted. The air felt heavier, charged with a subtle hum that vibrated in his chest. Every step made him more uneasy, as though something watched him from the shadows. Hours passed before he finally spotted it. A steep hill, unnatural in shape, rising above the forest floor. At its base, half hidden by tangled vines, was something that didn't belong, a set of reinforced steel doors embedded into the earth. Eric froze, his rifle instinctively raised. The doors were massive, marked with symbols he didn't recognize, spirals, jagged lines, and what looked like eyes. His stomach twisted. This wasn't standard agency work. He approached cautiously, sweeping his flashlight over the area. The steel doors showed no signs of rust or decay. Whatever this place was, it was active. His radio crackled. "Tate," the handler's voice said, "you've arrived." Eric stiffened. "You knew about this place?" "Yes," the handler admitted. "You are authorized to enter. Proceed." Eric's jaw tightened, but he pressed on. He ran his hand across the door's cold surface, finding a control panel hidden beneath the vines. A few buttons later, the doors shuddered and began to slide open, revealing a dark tunnel that sloped downward into the earth. A faint, unnatural hum emanated from below, growing louder as the doors opened wider. Eric's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he gripped his rifle tighter and stepped inside. Whatever lay at the end of that tunnel, he would find it. Eric descended the sloping tunnel cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The hum grew louder with every step, vibrating through his boots and into his bones. The walls were smooth, metallic, and lined with conduits pulsing faintly with light, like veins carrying some kind of energy. This wasn't an old bunker or storage site. It was something far more advanced. The air shifted as Eric reached the bottom of the tunnel. A heavy door loomed before him, glowing slightly around the edges. He spotted a small biometric scanner set into the wall. He hesitated, glancing back up the tunnel. The surface seemed impossibly far away, as though the earth itself had swallowed him. "You knew about this place." The handler's words echoed in his mind. "Damn it," Eric muttered. He scanned the panel and pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle. The room beyond caught him off guard. It was a lab, massive, sterile, and bright, with high-tech workstations lining the walls. The hum he'd heard emanated from a colossal structure in the center of the room, a shimmering, swirling rift suspended in a series of mechanical rings. Energy pulsed from it, warping the air around its edges. It was mesmerizing and terrifying all at once, like staring into the void itself. Holy... Eric trailed off, lowering his rifle as he took it in. The room wasn't empty. Scientists in white lab coats moved around the rift, monitoring its movements and recording data on holographic screens. Strange specimens floated in vats along the walls, half-formed cryptids, their grayish flesh twitching unnaturally. This was no accident, no anomaly. This place was designed to study the creatures of Area 12. A voice broke the silence. "You're not supposed to be here, Ranger Tate." Eric spun around, his rifle snapping up. A tall man in a lab coat stepped from the shadows, hands raised in a placating gesture. He was older, his face lined with fatigue and something else, guilt. "Who the hell are you?" Eric demanded. "My name is Dr. Kessler," the man said calmly, "and you're standing in one of the most important research facilities on the planet." Eric's gaze darted to the rift. "You're researching the cryptids? You're keeping this open on purpose?" Kessler nodded, seemingly unbothered by the accusation. "The rift is a doorway, Ranger Tate, a window into another dimension. These creatures don't belong to our world, but they've adapted. Understanding them could save humanity one day." "Save us? From what?" Eric barked. "You're the reason they're spreading." Dr. Kessler's expression darkened. "We're containing them, not spreading them. Everything we do here is necessary." Eric's finger hovered over the trigger. "Necessary? People are dying out there because of this." He gestured to the rift. "And you want me to believe you're helping?" Before Kessler could answer, a klaxon blared. The lights flickered and the hum from the rift shifted in pitch. Eric turned to see the shimmering energy fluctuate, its pulse growing erratic. Scientists scrambled to their stations, their faces etched with panic. "What's happening?" Eric demanded. Kessler's voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "It's destabilizing." Eric felt his gut tighten. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means," Kessler said quietly, "they're coming through." Eric spun back toward the rift, his rifle snapping up. Shadows flickered within its depths, shapes twisting and clawing toward the light. The cryptids were here. The rift roared to life, its shimmering surface distorting and swelling as shadows clawed their way through. A piercing screech echoed across the lab, metal straining against an unseen force. Scientists scattered, their shouts lost in the din of alarms and energy pulsing from the portal. Eric's instincts screamed at him to move. He shouldered his rifle and backed away, eyes locked on the rippling rift. The first cryptid emerged, a massive, grotesque thing that looked like a hybrid of the skewers and something far worse. Its elongated limbs dragged behind it, claws sparking against the lab floor, its head twisted unnaturally, glowing orange eyes locking onto Eric. "Contain it," Kessler shouted. "Seal the blast doors." "Seal them now!" a panicked scientist screamed, slamming their fist against a control panel. The steel doors began sliding shut, but the creature moved with blinding speed. It slammed into the doors, the impact reverberating through the lab, and forced its claws into the narrowing gap. Sparks flew as metal buckled beneath its strength. Eric didn't wait for an invitation. He opened fire. The crack of his rifle echoed in the chaos, rounds slamming into the cryptid's chest. Black ichor splattered across the walls, but the creature barely flinched. It let out a guttural roar that made Eric's bones vibrate and lunged forward. "Get back!" Eric shouted, pulling a grenade from his vest. He yanked the pin and lobbed it toward the beast. The explosion rocked the lab, smoke and debris filling the air. Eric ducked behind a console as shrapnel pinged off the walls. When he glanced back, the creature was sprawled on the floor, its body twitching, but its glowing eyes still burned. "It's not down," Eric growled, reloading his rifle. "What the hell is this thing?" "It's a riftborn," Kessler said grimly, pulling a scientist to their feet. "Something new. We don't even understand it yet." "Perfect," Eric muttered, firing another burst of rounds into the cryptid. This time the shots struck its head, and the creature spasmed violently before going still. The alarms continued blaring, and a second shadow rippled in the rift. Eric's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned toward Kessler, his voice sharp. "Tell me how to shut that thing down. Now." Kessler hesitated, glancing at the shimmering portal. We can't. What do you mean, can't? Eric barked. It's spewing monsters into the world. Kessler stepped forward, his hands trembling as he pointed toward the surrounding consoles. All our equipment shows that if we try to close the rift, there could be an explosion, or an implosion of unimaginable size. We cannot risk it. Eric's stomach sank. Then I guess we're screwed. Before Kessler could respond, the lights flickered again, plunging the lab into an eerie half-darkness. Another creature began to emerge from the rift, this one larger and more serpentine, its spined body undulating as it clawed its way free. We're losing containment, a scientist screamed. Eric didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward a nearby console, sweeping his flashlight over the controls. Kessler shouted something behind him, but Eric's attention was pulled to a new detail, a monitor displaying a faint blueprint of the facility. At its center was the rift, labeled Project Gateway. But beneath it, another schematic caught his eye. Subject E1. Eric squinted, trying to make sense of the data. It showed a human silhouette. His silhouette. Biometric stats were listed alongside it. Reflexes, enhanced. Strength, enhanced. Resilience, prototype, unstable. Eric's blood ran cold. What the hell is this? Eric, Kessler called softly. There's something you need to know. Eric turned sharply, his rifle still raised, his voice a low growl. What am I looking at, Kessler? Dr. Kessler didn't meet his gaze at first, instead glancing toward the flickering rift where more cryptids threatened to break through. It's you, Eric, he said quietly. Subject E1. You're not what you think you are. Eric's pulse pounded in his ears. What the hell does that mean? He demanded, his finger twitching against the trigger. Kessler took a step forward, his hands raised in placation. You were created, Ranger Tate. Engineered. You're a clone, part of a classified program designed to combat the cryptids. The strength, the reflexes, your ability to endure what no one else can. It's not natural. Eric's chest tightened as the pieces fell into place. The impossibly quick recoveries, his endurance against creatures that would rip apart any other human, the way he'd never received reinforcements despite the overwhelming odds. His entire life in Area 12 had been one long lie. You're telling me I'm a weapon? Eric said, his voice cold. Kessler nodded, his gaze finally meeting Eric's. A superhuman clone, fine-tuned for combat against the Riftborn. You were deployed here because you're the best chance we have at containment. Eric took a step back, his mind racing. He glanced at the monitor again, his own stats displayed like a lab rat's experiment. Reflexes, strength, prototype. His whole life reduced to a handful of cold clinical data points. He thought of the handler's words every time he'd asked for backup. You're on your own. But my memories, my family, all implanted, fabricated to keep you grounded. Please understand. We didn't have a choice. You've seen what comes through that rift. These creatures would overrun the park if not for you containing them. And you expect me to keep playing along? Eric snapped, turning his rifle toward Kessler. Before the doctor could answer, the rift pulsed violently, sending shockwaves through the lab. The lights flickered, and a piercing hum reverberated through the room. Eric staggered, steadying himself as the shimmering energy of the rift expanded. A new creature emerged. It was enormous, easily twice the size of the riftborn Eric had killed earlier. Its sinewy, spined body undulated as it slithered forward, its claws clicking against the steel floor. A deep, unnatural screech escaped its maw, and its orange eyes locked onto Eric like a predator identifying its prey. "We can't hold it!" a scientist screamed. Eric shoved Kessler aside and raised his rifle, his training kicking in. He fired a burst of rounds at the creature's face, the bullets sparking off its thick hide. The Riftborn recoiled but quickly recovered, its serpentine body coiling as it prepared to strike. Kessler scrambled to a console, shouting over the chaos. "Eric, listen to me. If we overload the rift, it'll collapse, but it'll take this whole facility with it. We have no choice now. The Riftborn incursions are not stopping. We will have to risk it." Eric's eyes flickered toward the rift, the pulsating energy throwing grotesque shadows across the room. "And if we don't?" Kessler hesitated. Then everything gets out. The creature lunged, its claws swiping inches from Eric's face as he dove out of the way. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Fine," Eric growled, reloading. "Tell me how to blow this damn thing up." Kessler's face twisted with hesitation as the lab descended into chaos. The Riftborn screeched, its claws gouging deep furrows into the steel floor, closing the distance between itself and Eric with horrifying speed. Eric fired another burst into its head, but the rounds ricocheted harmlessly off its armored hide. He gritted his teeth. "Kessler!" Eric barked, vaulting over a console as the Riftborn's claw slammed into a workstation, shattering it. "I need answers now. How do we shut that thing down?" Kessler scrambled toward a nearby console, hands flying across the holographic interface. "We can overload the containment generators," he shouted over the alarms. "It'll destabilize the rift and collapse it." Eric's mind raced as he unloaded another magazine into the creature. The bullets only seemed to slow it down, buying him precious seconds. He didn't care about the facility. He didn't care about Kessler's experiments. If the rift collapsed, the cryptids would be contained, but that would include him. "Eric," Kessler shouted desperately, noticing his hesitation. "This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. If the rift stays open, these creatures will breach every boundary, every containment zone. The entire world will be a hunting ground." Eric ducked as the Riftborn smashed a console to his right, sparks raining down around him. He fired again, aiming for its glowing eyes this time. The shot struck true, and the beast shrieked, recoiling briefly. Kessler took the opportunity to activate the overload sequence. A low mechanical whine filled the lab, and the rift pulsed violently, its energy flaring outward like ripples on a pond. The air grew heavy, vibrating with an unnatural force. Eric staggered, his gaze locking onto Kessler. "You're really going to blow this place?" Kessler nodded grimly. "It's the only way. You were designed for this moment, Eric. You have to hold them off long enough for the collapse to complete." Eric clenched his jaw, rage boiling beneath his stoic exterior. "I didn't sign up for this. You made me for it. And look what you've accomplished," Kessler shot back, desperation tinging his voice. "You've kept the world safe for years. You're not just some weapon, Eric. You're humanity's last line of defense." Eric froze at those words. In his gut, he'd always suspected he was more than just another ranger. The way he healed faster, moved quicker, fought harder, it wasn't natural. And now he knew the truth. They'd made him, engineered him for this exact moment. The Riftborn let out a deafening screech, its serpentine form coiling again, preparing for a final devastating strike. Eric didn't hesitate. He turned to Kessler. "How long until the collapse?" 5 minutes, Kessler replied. "Then you better start running," Eric said coldly. Kessler didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed a nearby data drive and sprinted toward the far exit, shouting for the remaining scientists to follow him. Eric turned back to the Riftborn, his grip tightening on his rifle. 5 minutes was all he needed. Whatever he was, man, clone, or weapon, he would finish this fight. "Come on," Eric muttered, steadying his aim as the creature lunged. "Let's see what you've got." The Riftborn lunged, its massive body closing the distance in a heartbeat. Eric threw himself to the side, landing hard against a console as the creature's claws tore into the ground where he'd been standing. Sparks exploded from shredded equipment, and the lab's emergency lights flickered ominously. Eric scrambled to his feet, reloading his rifle as the Riftborn coiled to strike again. The air thrummed with energy from the destabilizing rift, its glow intensifying, casting long, jagged shadows across the shattered lab. Every instinct told him he was running out of time. He fired again, aiming for the creature's glowing eyes. 2 shots struck home, sending the Riftborn reeling backward with an agonized shriek. Black ichor oozed from its face, but the creature was far from dead. It lowered its head, its glowing gaze now locked onto Eric with animalistic fury. Over the din of the rift and the alarms, Eric heard his radio crackle. "Eric!" The handler's cold, clipped voice filled his ear. "Report your status." Eric's blood boiled at the sound. "You already know," he growled, firing another burst as the Riftborn charged again. The creature's claw slashed through the air inches from Eric's head as he ducked and rolled beneath its strike. "You knew about this place, about the rift, about me, didn't you?" There was a pause. Then the handler's voice came through, calm and deliberate. "We knew you would uncover it eventually." Eric froze for half a second, his heart pounding in his chest. "So you've been lying to me this whole time?" "We withheld what you didn't need to know," the handler said coldly. "You've always been part of a larger plan, Ranger Tate. A necessary plan." Eric dove behind a steel pillar as the Riftborn's tail lashed out, smashing through a wall and sending debris crashing to the floor. He keyed his radio again, fury burning through his exhaustion. "You built me for this job, didn't you? Why didn't I ever get reinforcements? Why am I the only one in Area 12? The handler's tone didn't change. "You didn't need reinforcements, Eric. You are the reinforcement. The others couldn't do what you do. Your enhancements, your speed, your strength, your resilience were designed to make you unstoppable. And so far, you haven't proven us wrong." Eric's grip on his rifle tightened as the Riftborn began stalking toward him again, its wounds already starting to heal. Enhancements. The word echoed in his mind, mocking him. He wasn't a hero, wasn't a ranger doing his part to protect the world. He was an experiment, created to fight and die so that others wouldn't have to. The Riftborn lunged, its screech splitting the air. Eric exploded out of cover, unloading his last rounds into its face. The creature staggered, blinded momentarily, giving Eric the chance to sprint to the nearest console. 4 minutes! Kessler's voice crackled faintly over the lab speakers. "Eric, the overload is nearly complete." "Good," Eric muttered, slamming a fresh magazine into his rifle. He turned back toward the Riftborn, his pulse steadying. If he was a weapon, then it was time to do what he'd been made for. No reinforcements were coming. There was no cavalry on the horizon. It had always been him, just him. "Come on, you ugly bastard," Eric said through gritted teeth. "Let's finish this." The Riftborn shrieked, a sound that rattled through the crumbling lab like an earthquake. Its massive body coiled, muscles tensing as it prepared to strike again. The rift's pulsing light grew brighter, erratic waves of energy spilling out and warping the air. Pieces of the ceiling cracked and fell, but Eric didn't move. He planted his boots on the scorched floor, rifle leveled at the monster. His thoughts were a storm of anger, confusion, and a grim resolve. The Riftborn lunged. Eric fired, every shot aimed at its glowing eyes. His enhanced reflexes kicked in. Time seemed to slow as the creature's maw opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. He sidestepped at the last possible moment, spun, and unloaded the remainder of his magazine into the back of its head. The creature roared, thrashing violently. Eric dove behind a console as the beast's tail smashed into a support column, sending a shockwave through the room. He landed hard, the impact jarring his ribs, but he pushed himself back up, adrenaline dulling the pain. His radio crackled with Kessler's voice. 2 minutes, Eric. The rift's collapsing. Get out of there." Eric ignored him. The Riftborn was still alive, its mangled form twitching as it rose to its feet. Black ichor oozed from the wounds in its head and shoulders, but its eyes, half-blinded now, still burned with predatory rage. It wasn't retreating. It was fighting to the death, and Eric intended to oblige. He holstered his rifle and drew his Glock, advancing through the smoke and debris. Every instinct told him to run, but his training, his programming, kept him moving forward. The creature lunged again, but this time Eric was faster. He slid beneath its swiping claws, his enhanced reflexes guiding him with uncanny precision. The moment he cleared its range, Eric rose and emptied the Glock into its mouth. The creature staggered, screeching as the rounds tore through its throat and skull. Eric didn't stop. He reached for a nearby console, grabbed a jagged piece of rebar lying amid the debris, and charged. With a roar of his own, Eric drove the metal spike into the Riftborn's exposed eye. The beast convulsed violently, its claws raking at the floor as it let out a final, deafening shriek. Eric leapt back, breathing hard as the creature's body collapsed with a thunderous crash, the ground trembling beneath its weight. The room fell eerily silent. Eric stared at the Riftborn's corpse, chest heaving. It was done. The lab lights flickered, the rift's glow now pulsing wildly. A low hum built into a deafening crescendo, and Eric's radio crackled again. Kessler's voice was strained. 1 minute, Eric. The rift will take everything down with it, including you. Eric looked at the swirling rift, its energy spiraling violently. Debris fell all around him, consoles exploding in bursts of sparks. The air was thick with smoke and ash. He was out of time. "Get out of here," Kessler shouted again. Eric turned toward the nearest exit. His enhanced legs carried him faster than should have been possible, his boots pounding against the collapsing floor. He sprinted up the sloping tunnel, the roar of the rift's collapse echoing behind him. The earth shook. The tunnel lights blew out in rapid succession. All Eric could hear was the deafening screech of the rift imploding. He didn't stop running, not yet, not until he was clear. The tunnel shook violently, dust and chunks of stone raining down as the rift's collapse ripped through the facility. Eric sprinted forward, each stride fueled by adrenaline and the sickening hum of destabilizing energy echoing behind him. The light from the lab, once blinding, now flickered erratically, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. The air vibrated as if the very walls were screaming, "Run faster!" The thought wasn't his own, more like instinct, a sharpened directive embedded deep in his engineered reflexes. His boots hit the slope of the tunnel, launching him forward as the ground cracked and splintered behind him. An explosion erupted in the distance. The ceiling groaned. Metal screamed. Eric didn't look back. He could feel the collapse closing in, the tunnel buckling as pressure built. As he ran, his mind flashed to Kessler's words, "You're not what you think you are." The truth gnawed at him even now. Was it his programming that pushed him to keep moving, or his will to survive? He didn't know anymore. The tunnel's exit finally came into view, the thick steel blast doors half open, outlined in pale moonlight. Relief surged through him, brief, fleeting, before another explosion rocked the tunnel. A section of the ceiling crumbled, jagged debris slamming into the ground with a deafening crash. Eric barely managed to slide under a falling beam, the heat searing the back of his neck. He dove through the blast doors. Behind him, the tunnel collapsed in on itself with a deafening roar. Eric hit the dirt outside, the impact jarring every bone in his body. He rolled instinctively, coming to a stop against the roots of a massive sequoia. A cloud of smoke and dust billowed from the tunnel's entrance, and then silence. Eric lay still for a moment, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face. His enhanced lungs pulled in deep, steady breaths, though the weight of exhaustion threatened to crush him. He glanced back at the obliterated entrance. The lab was gone, buried beneath thousands of tons of earth. And the rift? He didn't know. Slowly, Eric pushed himself up onto his knees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Even the wildlife seemed to be holding its breath. The faint glow of the moon filtered through the canopy, illuminating the clearing like a silver spotlight. It felt like another world entirely, removed from the chaos he'd just escaped. His radio crackled, breaking the silence. The handler's cold voice came through, calm as ever. "Tate, report." Eric didn't answer immediately. He wiped blood and dirt from his face, his rifle still clutched in one hand. The rage simmered low in his chest. Finally, he keyed the radio. "Facility's gone. The rift's sealed." "Understood," the handler replied without a shred of concern. "Return to base for further orders." Eric's lip curled. That was it? Facility's gone and they moved on like nothing happened? Like he hadn't just fought for his life, learned that he was an engineered weapon, and watched the earth swallow the horrors they'd created. He switched off the radio without replying. Eric stood, his muscles protesting with every move, and looked out into the forest. He could still feel the cryptid's presence, lingering at the edge of the shadows. Maybe the rift was gone, but its monsters, the ones that had already gotten through, were still out here. And so was he. Eric adjusted the rifle strap over his shoulder and walked toward the tree line. His enhanced reflexes steadied him, his mind clearing as he accepted the truth. He might be a clone, a weapon, a tool created by the agency, But he was also the only thing standing between those creatures and the rest of the world, and the job wasn't done yet. The forest stretched endlessly before Eric, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The destruction of the lab sat heavily in his chest, but there was no time to process it. The job, his job, wasn't over. He'd sealed the rift, but there was no telling what had already escaped before the collapse. The shadows felt alive, heavier than usual. His rifle was steady in his hands, his every movement silent. For a moment the woods were as they always had been, an ancient, indifferent witness. But Eric knew better now. These trees stood on a battleground, and he was the last man left standing. The radio on his chest crackled, breaking the illusion of calm. "Ranger Tate, this is command." The handler's voice cut through, as detached as ever. "Status update. Your silence is unacceptable." Eric stared at the tree-lined thumb hovering over the radio switch. He could hear their instructions in his mind before they even said them. Return to base, debrief, prepare for redeployment. It was always the same. The agency didn't care what he'd learned, what he'd survived. To them, he was just another asset, replaceable, disposable. Except he wasn't, was he? Eric keyed the radio, his voice cold. "The lab's gone. Rift sealed." "Understood," the handler replied without hesitation. "Return to base immediately. Your presence is required for debrief." Eric's lip curled into a grim smile. "What happens now, Command? You rebuild, open up another lab, send me back into the zone like nothing happened? Your concern is unnecessary, Ranger Tate. Your purpose remains containment. The next mission is already being prepared." The next mission. The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Eric's knuckles turned white around his rifle. A spark of rage flared, but beneath it something else stirred. Clarity. "No." The word came out before he could stop it, but it felt right. "Repeat that, Ranger Tate." The handler's voice sharpened. "I said no," Eric growled, stepping forward into the clearing, his eyes scanning the dark. "You lied to me. You turned me into this, and you didn't even tell me what I was. You keep opening doors you can't close, and every time it's me you send in to clean up your mess. Not anymore." Silence crackled over the line. Finally, the handler spoke again, colder than before. "You're compromised, Tate. Return to base immediately. Failure to comply will result in—" Eric switched off the radio and ripped it from his chest, letting it fall to the dirt with a hollow thud. For the first time, the silence of the forest felt freeing. He looked at the tree line, where the skewers and other horrors still lurked. They were out there now, scattered and leaderless, but they weren't gone. Eric knew what that meant. The job still fell to him, but this time it was on his terms. "You want containment?" Eric muttered to the dark, shouldering his rifle. "Fine, I'll contain it, my way." Whatever the agency thought he was, a weapon, a clone, a tool, they didn't own him. Not anymore. Eric moved forward into the forest, his steps purposeful. He would finish the fight one creature at a time because it wasn't just his job anymore. It was his choice. The cryptids didn't belong here. Neither did he. But as long as they stayed in Area 12, so would Eric Tate. And this time, no one would get in his way. Eric moved through the silent forest, his rifle slung over his shoulder, the agency's radio abandoned behind him. The woods seemed different now, just as dark, just as dangerous. But the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. For the first time in years, he wasn't taking orders. The fight was still his, but he owned it now. The wind whispered through the towering sequoias, carrying the faint metallic tang of cryptid ichor that still lingered in the air. It was a reminder that the job wasn't done. The collapse of the lab and the rift had bought time, maybe days, maybe weeks, but it hadn't ended the threat. The creatures that had slipped through before the rift sealed were out here, lurking in the shadows, waiting, but so was Eric Tate. He stopped at the crest of a hill, the moonlight spreading across the valley below. The remnants of the rift's energy still clung to the air like a stain, a faint hum vibrating in his chest. He didn't know if the rift was truly gone or if something else would take its place. The agency would rebuild, he knew that much. They'd send new teams, open new labs, and replace him with another weapon when they found one. But until then, the line was his. Eric knelt and pulled out a small handheld GPS, checking the perimeter markers for any breaches. The system hummed faintly, confirming the zone was stable, for now. He scanned the tree line with sharp, practiced eyes, looking for any flicker of movement, any glowing orange eyes staring back at him. Nothing. For the moment, the creatures were still. He leaned back against a thick tree trunk, allowing himself a rare moment to exhale. The memory of Kessler's words lingered in his mind. "You're humanity's last line of defense." Maybe that had been the plan when they made him. Maybe the agency thought they could control him forever. But they hadn't accounted for his will, his instincts, his choice. He thought about the rift, the swirling portal that had spewed monsters into the world. He thought about the lab, its twisted experiments and secrets buried now beneath a mountain of rubble. Part of him wished he could forget, pretend that his life had been normal, but he knew better. You're not normal. You never were. Eric accepted that now. Whatever he was, a weapon, a clone, a protector, it didn't matter anymore. He would fight because no one else could, because someone had to hold the line. And that someone was him. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint growl from somewhere deep in the forest. Eric's eyes snapped open, his muscles tensing as he stood and raised his rifle. The cryptids were out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. A grim smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he moved back into the trees. He didn't need orders, reinforcements, or handlers in his ear. This was his forest now, his battleground. And if the creatures came for him, he would be ready. As the shadows swallowed him, one truth remained. The cryptids would never stop. And neither would he. The line would hold.